Upon her release, YAE MIKO was one of the most hated and misunderstood characters. At the time, she just didn't feel good to play, and there weren't really many teams where Miko could stand out. But ever since her rerun and even Sumeru's release, her usage rate has been very good. The answer is pretty obvious to most of you, but let's dig a little deeper and explain why Miko was hated and then became one of the most loved and used characters across the entire player base. Remember to sub and like if you enjoyed, it would really mean a lot, and it would let the algorithm know that this channel exists. Thanks guys, I really appreciate it. So let's start when YAE MIKO was released. There were really mixed opinions about how she performed, mainly towards the negative side unfortunately. At the time, being an Electro DPS wasn't really the most ideal thing. Of course there were exceptions to that rule, but those exceptions were generally why Miko wasn't played that much. Raiden and Fischl were way better than Miko at the time, mainly because of how good their kits were. All that Miko had was damage. It was very good damage, I'll give it that, but that's all she had. It was mainly seen as a glorified 5-star Fischl. There are many flaws with her kit that most people did not like. Like a lot of other Catalyst users, she felt very clunky to play. Her rotations as an off-field DPS took very long compared to other characters of the archetype. She has to place 3 of her turrets, her burst, and then 3 turrets again. In total, that's like 8 to 9 seconds, which doesn't sound like much at first, but keep in mind that's a lot of field time for one character for a single rotation. Especially since Miko can do her damage off-field, and it really wasn't convenient for her since she could easily be interrupted during this time. Obviously, people that use her can easily adapt and just dodge, but that means you need to think, and if there's something that Genshin players do not like, it's thinking. Either way, it's just irritating and uncomfortable for most people to use Miko without a shield, since she spends a lot of time off-field and her particle generation was very mid. Having a 90 cost burst meant she either had to have another Electro character in the party, or build into energy recharge, and this really holds back her performance since a lot of her damage comes from her burst. Back then, being an Electro DPS character was tough, because there weren't really any good Electro reactions outside of maybe Electro Charge. Again, Miko was held back by this since she has a passive that allows her turrets to do extra damage based on her EM stat, but building EM onto an Electro character back then didn't really have a purpose, since most Electro-related reactions didn't contribute to a large portion of their damage. However, this is where Dendro comes in, and I'm sure a lot of you guys saw this coming, but I'll go into depth of why this matters more than you might think. With Dendro, there came a lot of new reactions, and a lot of which elevated Electro from being one of the worst elements in the game to performing really well in pretty much every abyss imaginable now. The Aggravate and Quicken reactions gave Miko a reaction that boosted her damage even further than before. Miko's performance skyrocketed since she has a passive that allows her to scale a bit into EM, which is huge since Aggravate also scales with the same stat. Aggravate is an additive reaction, which means it adds base damage before calculating the total amount of damage that's going to be done. It's very similar to something like Shenhe's buff for cryo characters. This is really important since that base damage can still be multiplied by crit, damage percent, and the damage debuffs dealt by a Viridescent Swirl. I believe Aggravate can also be influenced by character level, correct me if I'm wrong. Either way, EM became a much more valuable stat for Electro characters ever since Dendro was released. And since there are many more ways to buff EM stat, like Sucrose, Nahida, and even Fielded Dreams artifact set, building Miko was really easy. Of course it's still important to build into attack, crit, and damage percent, but having some extra freedom into your character builds is always welcomed. Nahida is also very good in a Miko team since she has a lot of Dendro application without being so energy hungry. Dendro in general made Miko's rotations feel less clunky since you didn't really need to spend much time on field worrying if you had the right buffs and debuffs up at the same time. Miko's turrets cannot snapshot the buffs that she's given, so managing the buffs and debuffs before Dendro felt very difficult to keep track of. Now, all you need to do is to make sure Dendro is applied every few seconds, which is much easier than what you had to do before. On top of that, it can stack with Dendro, the buffs that I mentioned before, like a Kazuha Swirl. You're probably wondering why I haven't mentioned Miko in a Hyper Bloom team. Although she can work in those teams, I wouldn't really recommend building full EM into her, since she has a rough time hitting the Dendro seeds off-field. I see it as more of a damage bonus, if anything, if you're using her on-field, but Miko is more consistent when using an Aggravate team alongside Fischl, since you can get her burst every rotation. But yeah guys, that's how Miko went from being one of the most hated characters to one of the most used and loved characters over time. If you guys enjoyed the video, remember to sub and like, it would really help the channel grow. Good luck to everyone pulling for her and YAE MIKO today, have a good night and day wherever you're at, and I'll see you all next time. Peace and take care guys, have a good one.